Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is State Leadership in Decarbonizing the Building Sector, featuring California and New York. This webinar is being presented as part of our series on the winners of the 2022 State Leadership in Clean Energy Awards, which is an awards series hosted by the Clean Energy States Alliance. And we'll have webinars later in November and December on other winning programs of the State Leadership in Clean Energy Awards. Before we get started with today's webinar, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect via your computer, mic, and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled on your screen here. You can also click on that orange arrow to expand your webinar console. One thing you might like to do with your webinar console is to submit your questions and your comments. We'll be saving time for questions following each state's presentation. So don't wait until the very end to submit your questions. We will get to as many as we can. And do type those in when you think of them. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email either this afternoon or tomorrow with a copy of the webinar recording, a PDF of the slides, and we'll also post all of those materials on our website at cisa.org/webinars. That is a good URL to know because it is also where we post all of our upcoming and archived webinars. So with that, I'll now pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. Let me first say a little bit about the Clean Energy States Alliance. We're a national membership organization. You can see our members on the screen. Most of our members are state energy agencies, and we do a lot of information sharing among them. We do outreach programs, group projects, and other activities. If we could go to our next slide. And one of the things we've done, as Samantha already alluded to, is we host the 2022 State Leadership in Clean Energy Awards. You can see the organizations that won awards this year by looking at the bottom. These awards are not selected by CISA staff. They're selected by a distinguished independent team of judges, and the list of the awards is here up on your screen. You can read more on our website, including a report with case studies of the different webinars. And as Samantha suggested, there'll be other webinars coming up in November and December, and we hope you'll go to those as well. If we can go to the next slide, let me introduce our panelists. You can see them up here. I'll introduce them all now. And I think when you see the presentations, you'll understand why both New York State and California won awards for their outstanding activities related to the building sector. We're going to hear first from New York, and there'll be two presenters. First from NYSERDA is James Manarino, who's a senior project manager, where he manages decarbonization initiatives in collaboration with affordable housing agency partners. As you'll learn, James and NYSERDA are working with New York State Homes and Community Renewal and also with New York City agencies on implementing decarbonization strategies and deploying resources to improve the quality, affordability, and energy performance of affordable housing. Prior to joining NYSERDA in 2020, James was a program manager at Partner Energy. And he will be joined in the presentation by Samantha Pierce, who's the Vice President of Sustainability at New York State Homes and Community Renewal, where she oversees the Weatherization Assistance Program, the Clean Energy Initiative Program, the Climate Friendly Homes Fund, and she aligns and implements agency sustainability standards with the state's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. She has over 10 years of experience supporting operators and owners to reduce costs through on-site training, data analysis, and technical field support. And after we hear from NYSERDA, in the second half of the webinar, we're going to turn to California, and we're going to hear from Will Vicente, who is manager in the Building Standards Branch at the California Energy Commission. He's dedicated to reimagining the built environment into one that is more inspired, more ecologically intelligent, and more equitably distributed. Throughout his career, he's worked to actualize verified zero emissions buildings. Currently, he leads the team at the Energy Commission that's responsible for maintaining and updating California's energy code and the companion software to it, and also related outreach and education programs. In 2019, he received the Net Zero Trailblazer Award for his leadership in climate action. So let's start with the first half of our presentation, which is going to focus on New York. And let me turn it over to James and Samantha. You're on.
Thank you, Warren. Am I coming through okay?
Yes, you are.
Great, thanks. So I'm trying to click through. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Warren and Samantha, for setting this up. Very happy and honored to be to have received this award, and obviously very excited to work with Samantha and her team at HCR on this exciting initiative. NYSERDA. Just a little bit about NYSERDA. We've been developing partnerships and incentive programs in New York since 1975. We are tasked with providing information to the market to increase market activity to achieve the state's carbon emissions reduction goals. And this program with HCR and this partnership is, I think, the most innovative so far. First, why are we doing this? There's two reasons. The state has very aggressive carbon emissions reduction goals, a 40% reduction by 2030 and an 85% reduction by 2050. We can't achieve those goals with vanilla energy efficiency alone. We have to decarbonize residential buildings in New York State. And many of those buildings are regulated or touched in some way by HCR and sister organizations. So we have these climate goals, and we also have market animation goals. So in 2022, Governor Hochul announced in her State of the State that NYSERDA, HCR, Department of Public Service, and Department of State are tasked with delivering a plan to reach 2 million climate-friendly homes, and that includes apartments, by 2030. To achieve that, so that's 1 million electrified homes or apartments and 1 million electrification-ready homes and apartments. We need to leverage partnerships with agencies like HCR. And I guess just for a sense of scale, the current sort of business as usual rate of electrification is 20,000 homes per year, and we need to increase that rate up to 200,000. And I think the capacity building and all the work that Samantha and her team are doing will lead to a lot of progress towards achieving that goal. I'm just gonna say quickly on this because I think Samantha has a more detailed slide on the partnership But on this, I'll just say that NYSERDA thus far has committed to providing $100 million to HCR, both in the form of project subsidies and incentives for decarbonization scopes in both new construction and existing buildings, but also investing in contractor support, technical assistance to build capacity within HCR to handle these types of projects going forward. I think another exciting element of this is the new incentive delivery model. The business as usual approach from NYSERDA has been to access NYSERDA incentives. Developers had to put together bespoke NYSERDA applications and reports, wait for NYSERDA approval, go through revisions with NYSERDA, and then once the project was done, submit another application or report to access the incentives from NYSERDA, and that led to some lack of certainty and clarity and confidence on the developer side. And what we're doing here is integrating both access to NYSERDA incentives and payment of NYSERDA incentives within established HCR processes. Samantha might correct me on some of these characterizations, but high level, how this Clean Energy Initiative incentive program works is that when developers apply for either 9% or 4% financing from HCR, they can also opt in to apply for NYSERDA incentives if those projects are vying to achieve decarbonization scopes. So from the developer's perspective, there are much lighter lifts basically to access NYSERDA incentives, and they're going through LIHTC application processes that are very familiar. And the incentives themselves are paid out over the course of construction, so developers don't have to wait until the project is done to hopefully get sign off and approval from NYSERDA and get those incentives. We'll be reviewing construction progress and funding requests and paying out our incentives alongside HCR financing dollars. And this gets to the technical assistance and capacity building. So just like HCR and other affordable housing agencies have engineering departments and project managers that oversee projects and make sure they comply with qualified allocation plan criteria and design guidelines, with these relatively novel scopes, at least in New York, decarbonization scopes, electrification retrofits. We are providing technical assistance to work with HCR project managers and program managers to both assess project design, review payment applications, and doing all of that in the background alongside HCR project managers, bank engineers, whomever. So that's the program administration side of these technical assistance providers, but we also have a bench of contractors that can work directly with owner teams that may not be familiar with building to decarbonization standards, doing electrification retrofits, or achieving passive house or near passive house performance. So we have a bench of contractors that are available to assist owner teams as needed. And with that, I think I will pass it over to Samantha.
Great, thank you so much, James, and thank you to Samantha and Warren for the introduction. A quick little just overview. HCR, or Homes and Community Renewal, is New York State's affordable housing agency, as I'm sure James has made clear to all of you thus far. But we're a bit unique here in New York. We're not just an HFA. We're actually comprised of 5 different state corporations, agencies, and divisions. And so you can see here, we are So HCR is an umbrella agency for these 5 agencies, both our mortgage agency, our HFA, which is the state's HFA, of course, also our Housing Trust Fund, and our Affordable Housing Corporation and Division of Homes and Community Renewal. I think that's important context because for the big scale of work that James mapped out at the top of his presentation, we're really looking at all different areas of our agency and how we can deploy best practices around decarbonization, high performance energy efficiency upgrades, and health and safety improvements that are needed to reach those high performance, low carbon initiatives. And so specifically, the Clean Energy Initiative focuses on our HFA and HTFC portfolio, which focus on multifamily housing. Well, the program focuses on multifamily housing within those 2 agencies. Our HFA being the issuer of our what we call our 4% bond tax credit program, and HTFC being the issuer of the state's 9% competitive tax credit program, both of which are required to be utilized when a recipient of CEI is applying for the Clean Energy Initiative or CEI funds. Next slide. I realized, James, thanks. I realized I have to go on camera. Yeah, it went forward. Thanks so much. And hi, everyone. So as James mapped out for us in the opening here, HCR has been working in sustainability for a number of years, but really excited as the Climate Action Council, as appointed by the state's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, was formed, really developed a deep partnership with our partners at the State Energy Agency, NYSERDA. And so we developed a work stream for our 2 agencies to collaborate on multiple fronts. And so you see those up on the screen here, really focused on being able to build capacity within HCR as an agency to deploy clean energy funding in a long-term way. And so recognizing that individual program funding is really critical, but also acknowledging that in order to sustain and reach our long-term goals as a state, we need to build that capacity within. And really lucky to have a partner like NYSERDA who was able to be creative here and help us through contracting and other collaborative means and methods to develop a robust training and supportive process here. And so the paramount program that came out of that is in fact Clean Energy Initiative. And as James mentioned, we are also really partnering very deeply with technical support to provide not only technical assistance to awarded projects of the Clean Energy Initiative, but also technical support within HCR to ensure that we have the ability to both review those projects as they come in, as well as provide important training and technical support for our staff to build their capacity to understanding decarbonization technology. We're also really focused on coordinating on our processes and our guidelines, which I'll speak to in a second, so I won't go into too much detail there. And I think really paramount for me, having been an engineer before this, data and research is really a foundation to all the work that we do, so that we're continuing to build off of programs like our Clean Energy Initiative and continue to track and monitor how those investments and those projects are actually operating in the long term. And then, of course, most importantly, perhaps ensuring that we have a strategy that really aligns with our state's goals of decarbonization, and that our 2 agencies who historically have operated fairly separately are really in lockstep, as shown by all of the initiatives that I've just outlined. Next slide, excuse me. So as I mentioned, one back. Thanks, James. So as I mentioned, one of the key components to our collaboration here is building out a really transparent and transformative standard for the industry in the affordable housing space within New York State. And so in the summer of 2022, we released a new set of sustainability guidelines, which did not exist prior to. And with the help and support of NYSERDA, both technically and collaboratively, we created a series of 3 booklets, 2 of which you see pictured here, we have both our new construction guidelines and our existing buildings guidelines, which really build on an existing design guidelines booklet that the agency has had, which are required for compliance for all of our tax credit programs. That was 4% and 9% competitive tax credit programs that I mentioned. And the reason this is really important is because it sets a baseline standard for how the state will fund and award projects going forward, as well as sets and establishes what we call within the booklets a series of stretch goals. So these stretch goals are now aligned with what we will fund for our clean energy initiative, so that an owner can really, or a developer can review these documents and decide if they're able to reach towards those stretch or deeper decarbonization pathways, or just do basic compliance with the guidelines. And as of note, I will just mention that since we applied for and received the award from this agency, we have actually now required in our new construction projects via this guidelines that all new construction projects applying for financing for any of our tax credit projects must be all electric and high performance buildings. So we're really excited to set that standard and ensure that, with maybe minor exceptions, that all projects the agency funds going forward in 2023 and beyond will be all electric high performance buildings as a baseline. Next slide. So the Clean Energy Initiative, as you've heard James mention, is really taking the lessons learned that we heard from our development communities and ensuring that the process for accessing these funds is easy and streamlined. And so, as James mentioned, and appropriately so, previously developers would go to NYSERDA, and the one challenge that I'll add there in the old structure was that when you look at affordable housing specifically, when you do the underwriting to finance a project, certain dollars, like incentive dollars that NYSERDA typically offers, typically come in as on the back end of a project, meaning a developer cannot use those funds as a source in their original baseline underwriting. And developers have to essentially front the money from other locations at the closing for construction funds. And so by moving the process internal to HCR and taking the same funds, but having HCR deploy them to the market, we've now transitioned those funds to being eligible as a source of funding, removing the barrier of developers having to sort of fill that gap temporarily during the construction process. So we think that's really exciting, and we've gotten great feedback thus far. And we're, I think that's a major shift and positive outcome of this program. Next slide. And so we have been updating. In the summer of 2021, we released a pilot version of the Clean Energy Initiative, which was at the time only available for new construction projects and was funding projects that reached passive house or near passive house standards. And since then, we've actually updated the program and expanded it to now include both specifically a carve out for what we call adaptive reuse, or taking an existing building that was not formerly housing and converting it to a housing use type, as well as adding in an existing buildings track. And so you can see here that we have various different funding levels available for each one of the eligible funding areas. So for new construction, we have two different funding levels. The baseline is our $5,500 a unit, and that's for projects that go above and beyond, and as I mentioned, reach the stretch goal in our sustainability guidelines. And that's equivalent to reaching a LEED B, D, and C gold standard or higher, and a LEED Zero certification, or reaching passive house certification, or reaching Enterprise Green Communities Plus standards. For our adaptive reuse, those are the same standards that we're looking for a project to comply with. However, we recognize on the financing side that may take a little bit more funds to get there. So we're offering up to $12,500 per unit. On the new construction side, I'll just point out that we did allocate what we're calling a boost, which is an increase in funding for the new construction side that would go up to $7,500 a unit. And that's for projects that have a little bit more challenge in reaching those standards that would make it eligible. So this is for projects that are over 20 stories or under 60 units, but over 4 stories. And there's a few other eligible boost items that are in this list, of which a project only needs to meet one of those to be considered eligible for the boost funding. And now our existing buildings track is a little bit different. It's a little bit more prescriptive, where an owner can choose, or developer can choose, 1, 2, or 3 of an eligible scope items, which if we go to the next slide, I will describe a bit. And as we're doing that, all projects can use the funding up to $1,000 per unit of the total funding for soft costs. That's another change that we realized in the pilot. We were overfunding soft costs, and there was a greater need for hard cost funding. And so just very briefly for our existing buildings track, these are the 3 eligible items. And if I was an existing building owner, I would have the opportunity to, as an example, select goal 1 and goal 3 if I so chose. So I would be doing improvements to my building envelope that met these standards requirements that are listed here on the screen, as well as electrifying my heating system. And that would make me eligible for $21,000 per unit. Now, if I was another building owner and I decided that I wanted to do goal 1 and goal 2, that would make me eligible for $12,500 a unit in eligible CEI funding. And the really interesting thing that we've done here is we've actually created term sheets for each one of our offerings: new construction, adaptive reuse, and existing buildings. And we've shifted from our pilot phase, where owners had to apply and essentially submit a base building, and in their narrative and application describe what they would need to do to reach the all performance standard. Our new version of our program is much more streamlined and now provides a term sheet with an as of right award, meaning if projects submit their design that meet these standards and can show that, then they are eligible for the funding, thus making the clean energy funds even more accessible to the affordable housing community. Next slide. And so, as James mentioned, we really see the role of the technical assistance provider as part of our clean energy initiative as a paramount component to building capacity within the market. So the intention here is not just to help the building developer or owner with one particular project, give them funding and have them move on, but really to help deepen their own benches and to provide additional support to their energy management teams, their architects, the collaboration of the whole development unit, to ensure that the next project they can do even more efficiently and effectively, having gained expertise from a particular technical assistance provider with very specific knowledge in passive house and decarbonization work. And so pairing those development teams with a designated no-cost technical assistance provider, essentially as their own Google for how to build these really deep decarbonized sites, we think will really reap benefits in the long term as building owners continue to develop these projects, and we continue to move the baseline up higher and defund some of the incentives as we go forward in the long term, not in the short term. Don't want to scare anyone there. We recognize that this is a long cycle to get there, but that's the vision long term. So we're really excited that the program has to date funded 10 different projects, and we have a $100 million commitment from NYSERDA to fund and continue to fund this program through HCR and really deepen the collaboration of a state housing finance agency as well as a state's energy office. And so we think this is an innovative and exciting model, and happy to have been here and chatting about it. And James, I think that's the last slide, but we'll just go to the next one just to make sure. Oh, sorry, I almost forgot about the best part. I do apologize. So my last slide here is just a quick overview of, what does this actually look like? I mentioned we've funded 10 projects thus far through the program. And this is one example, which happened to be an adaptive reuse project located up in the Rochester area of New York. It was an old manufacturing site that was being converted to housing while still retaining a portion of the manufacturing on site, making it just a really robust, interesting project, which is also a historic site. So just for folks that might not be familiar with affordable housing, this particular site, in order to finance it, I believe in talking with the developer, there's always over 20 sources of financing, including the ones that you see here, of which CEI contributes $1.675 million of funding, as well as some of the other tax credit programs, including the low-income housing tax credit covering a majority of the development costs. And so the overall project investment is $84 million. And as I mentioned, the really exciting thing about this is not only is it a decarbonize project, but also really innovative in retaining and maintaining the jobs in the area, as well as adding additional housing to the neighborhood. So now I think that concludes our presentation. If we go to the next one. Yes, thank you very much for your time. And Warren, do I pass it back to you now?
Yeah, I'm going to have questions for you and for James. We've received a few questions here, and thanks for a very good presentation that gives a nice overview of what the program is up to. The first question is, as you move forward, thinking about the existing housing stock, what do you see as the turnaround time between somebody submitting an application and then getting an answer as to whether they're going to receive funding?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have two different programs, as I mentioned, and unfortunately, they're two very differently operated programs by sort of design. And so the answer in that varies a little bit. On our competitive program, which is our 9% low-income housing tax credit, that program has a very specific award cycle. So an application for the whole tax credit goes out, and then there's a period of time where the applicants can respond. And then I believe 90 days after that we respond back and advise who has been awarded funds. So there's a very prescriptive process on the 9% side. And because we've now layered in the Clean Energy Initiative funding within our tax credit program, the CEI funding follows that same sort of time cycle and review process. On our 4% bond competitive program, that's an open window program, so there's not a structured start and end time. And for that, depending on how fast a project is moving and the pipeline that we have, it's a little lengthy right now because there's more need for affordable housing than there are dollars in any one cycle. So it could vary anywhere between like 6 months and more than that, depending on the project's viability when it applies to us. But in terms of CEI, we do try to be responsive on the 4% side in reviewing the specific application component for the CEI dollars. So that's a much smaller window, probably a month to 2 month turnaround time for that. But that's pending their eligibility for the larger program.
Thanks. And from the standpoint of the developers, in addition to the fact that obviously they like the fact that the funding is available, what have you gotten the best response from about this program? What do they like most about the program and how you've set it up?
Well, I can share what I've heard, and then James, if you've heard anything in addition or different, please let me know. But I think the best thing we've heard is really the streamlined application process. Even during our pilot phase, the developers really appreciate not having to go to 2 state agencies and rather just going to 1. So it makes their administrative burden a bit more streamlined, and I think their consultants appreciate that.
I'll just add another piece of positive feedback we've gotten is the cadence, I guess, at which incentives are paid out. So now, as opposed to waiting until the end of a project and kind of reapplying to NYSERDA for incentives, our incentive dollars are paid out proportionally against, I guess, every requisition or funding request the project submits to HCR or the bank during their construction period. So that gets to Samantha's point earlier about being able to recognize these incentive dollars as a source and not having to borrow against that amount. So there's some certainty added there.
Good. And do you have any plans for doing outreach and education about some of the successful completed projects once they are completed?
We did include that actually as a requirement in our application, where we asked them to talk about what their excuse me, I just like lost my train of thought, for the applicants to talk about what their data collection was going to be long term, and that they would need to share that with us. So we do anticipate benchmarking these properties. We do that sort of as business as normal within HCR, but we do anticipate being able to write some white papers and really doing a deep dive, not just on the energy use in the properties, but adding into the CEI program specifically with our pilot phase, a requirement for building owners to share their operational data with us, meaning are they spending more or less on the maintenance to maintain this new equipment and building typology. And so really being able to have a dialogue with them is all part of the commitment that the developers have taken on as part of receiving the Clean Energy Initiative funds.
Good, thanks. And let me ask one more question that came in, which refers specifically to heat pumps. And this person was talking about the fact that there was a challenge to heat pump manufacturers, and that NYSERDA is now looking at window mounted heat pumps that don't require a contractor to install. And this person was asking about what sort of evaluation NYSERDA did about the feasibility of that technology, or the proposals for the technology that the manufacturers are going to be disseminating across the state.
Yeah, so that is, I believe, around our Clean Heat for All initiative that we are implementing. It's another partnership. We're doing this with New York City Housing Authority and New York Power Authority. And I'll just speak to that like at a high level, but if I miss any points, please let me know. So NYPA ran the procurement. NYSERDA, NYCHA, NYPA coordinated on putting together the specifications we wanted to see in that window heat pump. As this person pointed out, something that can be installed by non-specialized labor, property management staff, can be plugged into a standard wall outlet, doesn't require any drilling or running of refrigerant lines. It's a cold climate, window mounted unitary heat pump. We awarded 2 manufacturers that submitted proposals in response to NYPA's RFP. That's Medea and Gradient. And they will be installing, each manufacturer, I believe, will be installing 30 of these window heat pump units next year in NYCHA housing, and NYSERDA is funding and overseeing the measurement and verification performance of those window heat pumps over the next 2023-2024 heating season. And pending the success of that, we'll move forward with the rest of the purchasing of these units for NYCHA housing, but also obviously see a ton of application for these units, especially for, and in New York City, pre-war building retrofits, electrification. A window mounted option would drastically reduce costs of electrification. So yeah, we see applicability there, and we'll continue coordinating with NEA and NEEP on certification, and and with HCR on these scopes, and seeing if they're applicable for HCR and HPD as well.
Hey, well, thanks very much. Thanks to both of you for talking about this program, and I think listeners can easily figure out why something like this was looked on favorably by the judges for the State Leadership in Clean Energy Awards, and we hope other states will try doing something similar. We're going to now move across the country and go to California. Folks on the line will probably remember, if they were here at the beginning of the webinar, that I already introduced Will Vicent, and I'm now going to turn it over to him for his presentation. Will, you're on.
Thank you, Warren. Here, I'll flash my camera there for a second, so you know that you're meeting with a real person, not a machine. So great to see everybody. Appreciate everybody spending time with us. And particularly thanks to CISA and the team for the recognition in California. It does really go a long way. Thank you very much for that. Maybe I should start out by saying, talking about recognition, the work that I have the pleasure of presenting here certainly is led by the state's Energy Commission, the California Energy Commission, but we have a large network of groups involved in codes and standards development. So the actions I'll be presenting here and the successes are part of a much larger group, and I'll try to bring some recognition to how that network is built out and works. So let's start off by setting some background in California. So California does have an economy-wide plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And based on this plan, California is on track and met its 2020 goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels. That's that line that you're looking at there, 4 years ahead of schedule, which is good news. So first of all, that we have a plan to me is really encouraging. And secondly, that we are at least currently on track to comply with California Assembly Bill 32. This is our Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. And this progress is largely the result of three large pillars of climate action strategies that are happening in California, those being to reduce emissions from the electric sector aggressively, to electrify transportation, and to electrify buildings. So that's all happening in California in a coordinated way. And thus far, the electric power sector has led the way, where proliferation of renewables have helped drop emissions by 44% since 2000. So that's pretty impressive. But if we look at the whole breakdown of the remaining emissions by sector, next to transportation, the second highest source of California emissions are those linked to everyday use of buildings, mainly natural gas heating and cooking. And so we know in California, we know now and have known for a while that to meet our state goals in 2030 and 2050 for climate action, the state is going to have to actively reduce source emissions from new and existing buildings. So thankfully, we have a great regulatory vehicle called the Energy Code in California, also known as Building Energy Efficiency Standards. This was established in the 70s by the Warren-Alquist Act. It's a really powerful, highly visionary proposed set of regulations that are now statute. It authorizes the California Energy Commission, the agency I work for, to update the Energy Code regularly and for our local jurisdictions to enforce those regulations. And roughly on a 3-year code cycle, this has been happening since the 70s. It's quite impressive to see that no new acts of legislation or powers from a greater power have to be enacted. This just kind of happens, and people know that it's happening in California roughly every 3 years, ratcheting down energy efficiency in buildings. As a result, California is using roughly 30% less than the rest of the US per capita. A key piece of this Warren-Alquist Act is that ensured that we have to be cost effective and technically feasible with the proposed standards that we adopt and approve. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, what's really exciting for me and others in California is that building decarbonization has already been identified as a least cost way to meet California's climate actions. So there's no backing down from it. We've got to decarbonize and reduce the amount of combusted fossil fuels in our buildings, our homes and businesses. So what we had the pleasure of getting recognized for by CISA is the 2022 Energy Code, which will go into effect this coming January 1 of 2023. Some of the main highlights of that update to the Building Energy Efficiency Standard definitely includes a continued focus on increasing efficiency in building envelopes and lighting. Those have been sort of a mainstay in the Energy Code in California. Some additional angles and developments that are particularly notable in the regulations that we adopted are heat pump baselines, and I'll discuss what that means in a little bit. Electric ready requirements for newly constructed homes, solar and storage baselines, I'll definitely unpack that, and then also have some really interesting ventilation requirements we think are the first in the nation that actually tip the scale in favor of electric appliances for cooking, which I can discuss in a bit as well. So a little bit of a focus on heat pumps. Thankfully, New York talked a little bit about them as well, doing great work over there. So the reason for the focus on heat pumps in the Energy Code is, and first it's worth mentioning that the California Energy Code is applicable to all newly constructed buildings, additions, and alterations in California. So these are big changes, an economy of 40 million people. And the focus, the star, sort of our 2022 update, is on heat pumps. And there's a very specific reason on that. We know that they're have been around a while and they're increasing dramatically in popularity. But in addition to being reducers of greenhouse gas emissions, they also encourage load flexibility, which in California, we know that the time that you use energy is becoming as important as how much energy you use. But they are also energy efficiency technologies. So they're sort of the trifecta. They accomplish all of our goals in one sort of appliance. So they're sort of a great star technology. In the 2022 Energy Code, we have now adopted and approved for new single family homes, water or space heating as standard. So when you create a new single family home, you have to install either a heat pump water heater or a heat pump space heater as standard. We say standard because it's more like a minimum requirement. If you have the option as a builder or developer to not install either, but you'd have to make up that efficiency in other areas of the Energy Code, such as envelope or lighting. Like most people, because our standards are aggressive, they'll be interested in doing the minimum requirement, which means that we expect at least one heat pump in all newly constructed homes in starting January of next year. These requirements or standards also apply to multifamily, where we have space heating as the standard, and a variety of non-residential or commercial space types. So this means both heat pump water heaters and space heaters, both of them are standards for schools, new schools. And then we also have some additional standards for offices, banks, libraries, retail, groceries. So this is a huge, we believe, start of going down the path of trying to transform the market. I know it's just newly constructed buildings, additions and alterations, and existing buildings are a largest piece of the pie there with buildings. But this is sending a very strong signal that the new standard is to include this type of technology in construction. It doesn't stop there. There's some other goodies with the 2022 Energy Code. We also have a requirement for dedicated electric circuits for single family and multifamily. This means adding the infrastructure there for space heating, cooking, clothes drying, and water heating. Also, again, the point about the time you use energy being as important as how much energy you use. We have energy storage system ready requirements for single family. So this means having an electric panel bus bar rating of 225 amps. And electric readiness just means that if you choose not to install efficient electric technologies, then you make it easier for homeowners to replace those natural gas technologies in the future, since they already have the infrastructure there. And if that wasn't enough, the 2022 Energy Code also builds on what we did in 2019. So you may or may not know that California was the first to require some level of solar, rooftop solar for single family homes in 2019. We are expanding those standards to various commercial types of building types This means high-rise multifamily, hotel, motels, offices down the line will have a minimum requirement for solar and battery. These are not expected to offset the entire electric load of the buildings. They're minimum sized to ensure that a majority, if not all, of the electricity that is generated on these buildings and sites is used on site. And just to summarize here, there's a number of contributions. This is sort of a summary of the environmental impact of these standards. They are analyzed from a 30-year sort of benefit, since these buildings will be there for at least that. And so every code cycle we do a projection with the smartest people we have to conservatively assess what the environmental impact is. Here's a breakdown of the various types of measures we updated and pursued, and what that emissions savings and dollar savings would be to the economy of California. In this case, it's roughly 10 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent and over $1.5 billion just with this code update. Now we're going to start to get into some of the items that make the energy code in California unique, and what enables us to push so aggressively. So part of it, if not the biggest part, is process. So we've got some accolades here taken from some public publications in which they demonstrate that California goes to great lengths to ensure a robust public process and we make sure that we talk to and collaborate with main industry leaders out there. So this is not just the building decarbonization advocates that are already there, but also the solar industry, environmentalists. We got to have great relationships with our builders and developers. And we make sure that everybody is aware of the regulations that are being proposed before we adopt them well ahead of time. I mean, in fact, we are already looking at the 2025 Energy Code now and collaborating with the public. Some other detailed nuances here. Apologies kind of for the eyesore, but this graphic and slide is meant to communicate and demonstrate some of the technical challenges and how we are able to push certain regulations across, like the heat pumps baselines. So we do technical and detailed analysis that represents the impact on the state. And we know that a state as large as California has a lot of diversity. So we do analysis for 16 different climate zones in the state. And we do this life cycle costing process. That's what that TDV means, time dependent valuation acronym stands for. We do a 30-year analysis and then bring that up to today's dollars in present value. And we compare the benefits against the costs, which is what you're looking at here for space heating and water heating in single family homes. The main takeaway from this slide is not meant to hurt your eyes, but meant to highlight that when we do this analysis, cost effectiveness as required by our statute does not pan out in all applications. So you're seeing in our California climate zone 5 and 8, space heating is not cost effective, and so they are not proposed as a standard. They were not proposed as a standard in our 2022 Energy Code. So this is just an example of the type of analysis that we go through to substantiate the regulations. A second thing that makes California a little bit unique, that we know the rest of the nation has some flexibility as well, is the fact that we create our own and maintain our own Energy Code compliance software. In California, that's known as CBEC, the California Building Energy Code Compliance Software. This is a software that we, again, update and maintain that allows designers, developers, and builders to make trade-offs for energy efficiency. So we have infinite number of ways to comply with any code. because people can use the software and plug in their project specifics and say, hey, you know, maybe heat pumps are not for me. I want to do more insulation in my walls or do more energy efficient other appliances. And so they can make those trade-offs in the energy code with this software. This software does not stand by itself. We have other industry partners who have more, I'll say, visually compelling options. So to perform compliance, you can use IES Virtual Environment, if you know that tool. We have Energy Pro, which has been a while. And these are great partners for California because they broaden the market and provide more usable, user-friendly tools to comply with the code. The basis of those compliance tools is this CBEC software, though. This is the reference software. We also have, to provide flexibility and support from industry, we also have other trade organizations that help us with certifying people to be qualified for running this type of analysis. So CABEC, our California Association of Building Energy Consultants, provides that network. You know, if you're looking for help to comply with the energy code and want to make trade-offs, then your best bet is reaching out to a CABEC certified energy analyst. And then we also have sort of a support network around the modeling ecosystem, which we call CalBEM in California. So there's a lot of people involved, even just in this energy modeling portion, to provide the flexibility that we believe our constituents want and benefit from. Now, sort of the last of the three main areas that I believe make the code unique in California, and hoping that's probably partially why we got recognized by CISA, thank you again for that, is this robust process. And it is robust in so much that we have not only just a web page, but we have a giant network of partners that work with us. And we open up a public docket. We have this docket or blog or whatever you would like to reference it as. We have a place always available to our public where they can provide any comments in an unfiltered way. And this conversation is tracked and logged in a transparent way here on these dockets. And we use these to respond to the public, hear public concerns, and ensure that we are hearing the public's concerns. We document and provide summary responses. And so that's a lot of the work. You know, so when people provide concerns or requests, then we've got a whole team that needs to respond publicly to them, and a team that also has to implement those proposed changes. So it's a big part of the energy code process. I mentioned the network that is the foundation, really, of the energy code in California. I think certainly California Energy Commission is part of it, but there are a number of other agencies who also recognize the CEC's, the California Energy Commission's role, and support our efforts with building energy efficiency standards. You may have heard of some of these, like the Air Resources Board, CARB, the Public Utilities Commission, the Building Standards Commission, just to name a few. Our sister agencies in California are really well coordinated, and we're coordinated with them and support our efforts. So much so that, for example, this is what I understand to be something unique in California. The Public Utilities Commission here in the state of California oversees and regulates our investor-owned utilities. As part of that regulation framework, they've also authorized the biggest utilities in California to support with resources and dollars the development of the energy code. So our biggest utilities in California are really tied at the hip with us in our development process, and really contribute a lot to our energy code development process and ensuring that the public is following along and has an opportunity to participate in those processes. So they're a huge part of, I think, what I think makes California unique. But it doesn't stop there. This is sort of apologies for the logo dump here, but there's a number of other agencies and organizations that are well plugged in and make up the Codes and Standards Network in California. Interestingly enough, the energy code is considered sort of a minimum bar, right? So we're the floor. In California, we are proud that our local governments, are the trailblazers. You know, they are the ones who are sort of competing against each other to comply with and exceed their climate action plans. And we have a really diverse, really plugged in set of locals in the state of California. The donut chart that you're seeing on the left is just a summary of how these local governments exceeded the floor or the energy code in the 2016 code cycle. You'll see there that a large portion of them were energy efficiency related. So that tells us in 2016, these locals wanted to exceed the energy code with energy efficiency actions, solar and electric vehicles. So that tells us what they're interested in as the leaders in the state. But then you look at the next code cycle, and you can see how things changed really quickly in just 3 years, where now the focus, in addition to the other things that were already there, now the focus is really on local actions being about all electric and electric readiness, or electric preferred. And so that tells us a lot. You know, that tells us in 2019, hey, we should be looking at these because they are of interest to local governments, and this is part of the reason they supported our updates to 2022, yet are still looking to exceed our 2022 energy code. So I mentioned this before, we are already ramping up for our next code cycle. Since we have a diverse set of attendees on the call, I thought it'd be worth mentioning that we're already kicking it off, and we're already having workshops for the next code cycle. It will be largely focused on the same priorities that I mentioned in the last slides, but encourage everybody on this call to get engaged if you are interested. Even if you don't live in California, we had a workshop yesterday where roughly half of the attendees were from outside of California. So hopefully there's a lot of benefit here, not only to our state, but to the rest of the nation with such a robust public process. Here is a dump of resources and links. If you do have a chance, I believe all the slides will be made available by CISA. And so this is just a resource for you all. And I will stop there, give us some time to discuss informally. So thank you all.
Hey, thanks very much there, Will. That's a really nice overview of the code there in California. Impressive activity that goes on perpetually, it seems. I had a bunch of questions come in for you. One had to do with that slide about 30-year benefits. One of the biggest benefits, with 26% of the total, was covered processes. What is that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's sort of the the hidden secret, or I wouldn't say it's a hidden secret because it's there, but the sleeping giant of our energy code. So we are associated with, thank you for pulling that up. We are associated often with buildings, right, new constructed buildings, but a huge amount of the emissions, as you saw in our pie before, is covered processes, which means industrial and agricultural processes. Now, when we include efficiency requirements in the energy code, a lot of times these will be applicable to those covered processes or industrial and agricultural processes. For example, we regulate heat recovery of some major processes and/or steam recovery from some of these larger processes. And because they are relatively minor changes, but that these loads are so big, these emissions are so big, then they end up being a huge piece of our contributing climate action. So that's what covered processes. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, no, that answers it perfectly. So we received several questions having to do with ground source heat pumps, whether they're included in the code, whether the efficiency benefits of them are measured differently than for air source heat pumps, and to what extent you distinguish between ground source and air source heat pumps in general.
Yeah, it's a great question. For our upcoming code in 2025, we are taking a closer look at try to provide more flexibility and credit for systems like ground source heat pumps. I can say that as part of the difficulty with ground source heat pumps, from my understanding, is that their efficiency is so local. It depends on all the elements there on your site, right? Do you have the groundwater movement? Do you have the soil conditions? And so we are trying to look carefully to provide some of that credit in 2025 or upcoming codes, but also making sure we have some technical merit behind those assumptions. In California, there are not a lot of those types of projects, but there is, like the question would infer, an increasing interest in that topic. And so we are trying to provide more functionality in that regard.
Good. And you talked about the software that's available. Is it free?
Yes, yeah. So the trade-off is like others have said, it's free, but it's certainly not the most beautiful software or easy to use. And that's why, I mentioned that we do rely on and depend on our partners who develop other for-profit tools. And so theirs are a lot more visually compelling, but we do offer the CBEC version for free, and we actually have some level of market there where some people use that as is.
Good. And you mentioned that the code applies not just to new construction, but to additions and renovations and alterations. What triggers the code? Say I want to remodel a small bathroom. Does that require me to convert to heat pumps for the whole house?
It may or may not. That's always the case. It depends. So just generally, an addition is anything that increases the conditioned square footage. And so, like if you're adding another room, yes, that's going to be an addition at a certain square footage. But also alterations mean major appliances if you're changing out your space heater or water heater. Whereas a bathroom may or may not trigger that. If you're keeping it the same size, then as long as you're not replacing any of the major appliances, then I think you're safe.
Okay, thanks. And I wanted to ask you about the reaction to heat pump water heaters. Have builders been accepting of the move towards heat pump water heaters in the code, or has there been any concern that homeowners weren't going to be happy either with the noise of heat pump water heaters or the ventilation requirements?
Yeah, that's a good question. Excuse me, Warren. And I think the right way to frame it is that there's definitely opinions on all of the spectrum. I can say in California, most of our stakeholders actually wanted us to push, if you're looking at sheer numbers, most of our stakeholders actually wanted to push further in the code to require all electric or two heat pumps. So that's kind of the landscape in California. But still, there's a lot of good concerns that are brought up with heat pump water heaters. Sort of the newness of the technology, not so much the technology, but the installation practice. And so we've got our work cut out for us to train and educate and help develop the market for installers and contractors in California for sure. That's part of the reason we said you'd have to install either or, not both at this stage. But some of the other points is, I know in new construction, tankless water heaters are really popular. And so sort of their support slogan is infinite hot water really quickly. And so there are some sort of market points and technical issues that we've got to think through. and there are some concerns, definitely. Thankfully, we're seeing, I'm sure everybody in this call is seeing the influx of public dollars that are being directed at incentives. So New York is doing a great job, but there's also expected to be lots and lots more dollars to help move the market to the STAR technology.
Good. Let me just ask you one last question. We have a number of people from other states, including state officials from those other states, who see what California has done and might think they should be doing something as ambitious as well. What advice would you have for other states?
My advice would be that you know your state better than us, right? So our energy code works for our state. We've got a lot of public opinion, a lot of loud voices, and this is where we landed. May not be the same with your conditions and your stakeholders. Everybody, for example, has a different fuel mix, how they generate their own electricity. For us, we're committed to getting to 100% clean energy by 2045, and we think we'll do so ahead of time. So this made all the sense in the world. But I can offer an olive branch that if any state is interested in pushing a little bit harder, we'd be happy to meet with you and discuss some of what we've learned out from doing analysis and pushing these regulations forward.
Hey, great. Well, thanks for that kind offer. I want to thank you and want to thank James and Samantha from New York from the presentations today. I want to thank everybody who came to listen, and Sam Donalds may want to tell everybody about upcoming events.
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the very beginning of the webinar, this webinar was part of a series on the winners of the 2022 State Leadership in Clean Energy Awards. So we have 2 other webinars coming up in that series, one in November featuring Connecticut and Washington, and another in December featuring Maryland and Oregon. So those should be really exciting, really great programs that we're profiling there. You'll hear from people from each of those states. We have a number of other webinars coming up, as you can see on your screen. So you can visit our website, cisa.org/webinars, for more information on those webinars and to register. To echo Warren's thanks, thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to everyone who attended today. And we hope to see you at the next one. Bye, everyone.